We've done Wilson, Head, and Technifiber. Now it's time to do an overview of Babolat's rackets. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Now that the Pure Strike has finally gotten an update, I figured it would be the perfect time to talk about the Babolat lineup. We've also got this gorgeous new 30-year anniversary Pure Drive, which may just be a cosmetic update, but it does look pretty sweet. So we're going to be talking about all three of Babolat's lines today, so the Pure Drive, the Pure Aero, and the Pure Strike. And I think after talking about every racket that Head has to offer, this one's going to be a breeze. Of course, before we go on, let me remind you that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me and the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. Now with just 3 lines, you may think that this is going to be simple, but that's not entirely true. Within each line, there are different models that go beyond just a change in weight or a change in string pattern. This is the list. I know there are some rackets that we don't carry, especially the 100 square inch Pure Strikes. I can't really talk about them if I've never played with them, but if we ever do decide to bring them in, I'll make sure to make a video. I'm going to go about this by ordering each racket within the lines, so Pure Drive, Pure Aero, and Pure Strike, but I also may talk about one racket and compare it to another one in another line if it's similar enough. Without further ado, let's talk about the Pure Drive 100. The Pure Drive 100 is the most popular racket in the world. It has been for more than a decade, and it's with good reason. I know some purists may disagree with me on this, but it's a fantastic racket that does a lot of things incredibly well. First and foremost, what makes the Pure Drive so popular, and this may surprise some of you because it's not its power, it's this racket's user-friendliness. When I was still working in the store and somebody came in with no preconceptions about any frames and demoed a Pure Drive along with something else, it was almost a guarantee that they would choose this racket. It's a 300 gram, 100 square inch frame, so right off the bat, it's easy to swing and has a big, forgiving sweet spot. But also, there are 0 quirks with this racket that might make someone need time to adjust to it. Take the VCore 100, for example, and that's definitely a slightly more extreme example of a racket with quirks, but it has such a unique head shape that some people won't be able to mesh with it, and definitely not right away. The Pure Drive is super standard, but in the best sense of the word. Some people may consider that boring, but I don't really think so, and I'm sure Babolat doesn't care because they've made a product that works for so many people, and they're definitely reaping the benefits. But beyond being the sort of designated people's racket, what else makes it so good? Well, the Pure Drive performs exceptionally well in most playability characteristics. Of course, with its thick beam and stiff flex, power is the #1 outstanding characteristic here. You get tons of pop off the string bed and also plenty of easy depth, which is part of why it's so user-friendly, but it doesn't stop there. It's also a 16x19 100, so it has plenty of spin potential, but it's not an outright spin racket, so it doesn't require spin the way some other rackets on this list do. Then you've got the control, and while it's not a control racket in the traditional sense, the Pure Drive does have this very solid, consistent feel that a lot of other power rackets don't have. It surprises me every time I play with it, but this racket doesn't have much of a wild side. It's obviously not a laser beam like a Prestige, but it does have more control than something like a Wilson Ultra, for example. So the Pure Drive 100's control is good, but it does still get a fair bit of shade from the more traditionalist side of the tennis community because it's far from a classic type of control. If you do want more control in a racket that still shares a lot of that power-oriented DNA, the Pure Drive 98 is a better option. The smaller head size makes the sweet spot smaller, which takes away from a bit of that user-friendliness and depth, and replaces it with more precision. The thing is, it still has a thick beam, a stiff flex, and quite a high launch angle, so you have to be a little bit more careful about controlling your shot than you do with true controlled 98s, but the power potential when you really get a hold of the ball is also much higher. To me, it is a little bit too unique of a racket and certainly harder to mesh with than the 100. I'm just not quite sure that increase in precision is worth the loss in user-friendliness and depth, and it certainly won't work for as many people. This powerful of a launch does feel a little bit out of place on a 98 square inch head-sized racket, and for those of you who are used to more traditional 98s, you may not like the stiffer, slightly more jarring feel that it has. Lead tape does help make it feel a little bit more plush. In fact, I think you need at least a 325 swing weight here, but it is still one of those rackets that I think you really need to know you like before you buy it. That said, in the right hands, as demonstrated by my mega talented hitting partner Benjamin here, it can be an absolute weapon. I am just briefly going to touch on the Pure Drive 100 Tour, but there isn't a ton to say about this racket because it's just a Pure Drive 100 with 15 extra grams. Adding static weight like that increases stability, so it feels a bit more solid and gives it a bit more plow through. To be honest, a lot of rackets respond really well to 15 extra grams. In fact, I usually recommend adding a bit of weight to control-oriented rackets, but with the Pure Drive, I think it does play a little bit better at that 300 gram static weight. Because of its beam design and higher stiffness, it doesn't really require that extra stability, and I'm not sure that sacrifice in maneuverability and swing speed is worth what you do gain in plow through. Beyond that though, everything I said about the Pure Drive 100 also applies to this racket, so it's fantastic, but I do think most people should go for the standard 300. So the Pure Drive has been around for longer, 30 years obviously, but ever since Nadal came onto the scene, the Pure Aero has been a fan favorite, especially for players who play with a ton of spin. In a lot of ways, the Pure Aero 100 is similar to the Pure Drive. It's also a 100 square inch, 300 gram racket that has a thick and stiff beam, so it's powerful and user-friendly. But the big difference here is that the Pure Aero requires spin, whereas the Pure Drive doesn't. The Pure Drive has that really solid feel that still works for flatter hitting, but the Pure Aero has many design characteristics that make it optimized for spin. The aerodynamic beam is shaped in a way so that when swung parallel to the ground, it accelerates quicker through contact, so that when you're brushing up on the ball, there's more racket head speed, so you get more spin. When you don't swing it parallel to the ground, so on flatter types of shots, it does feel quite clunky, almost like a sail catching the wind, so it does feel a little bit awkward for that style of hitting. Then you have the string bed and spin technology that has also been optimized to enhance spin as much as possible. Babolat did tone this back with the 2023 Aero by tightening up the string bed and reverting back to a more standard round grommet set, but the racket does feel more consistent when you're hitting with spin than when you're hitting flat. Between the Pure Drive 100 and the Aero 100, go for the Pure Drive if you want a more versatile racket that hits with tons of power. Go for the Aero if you want to optimize spin in a user-friendly racket. I added that little extra bit about optimizing spin in a user-friendly racket because this racket exists, and if you want to optimize spin in a racket that's perhaps a little less user-friendly but much more rewarding, the Pure Aero 98 is the perfect racket for you. There's a reason you see this racket in the hands of so many successful young professional players. It complements the modern attacking style so incredibly well. The Pure Aero 100 is great if you want to grind with spin, but because it's a 100, it lacks precision when you want to go for bigger shots and maneuverability to be considered a truly well-rounded all-court racket. Kind of like it was with power on the Pure Drive 98, the Aero 98 still has tons of spin potential, but such a more precise feel that you end up feeling much more confident going for big, powerful winners than you do on the 100. It really is a unique sensation when you hit with this racket, because combining this amount of spin potential with so much precision is not normal. I hope everybody understands that. There are other rackets with similar characteristics like the VCore 98 and Extreme Tour, but this is the one that combines the two better than any other racket on the market right now. Also, compared to the Pure Drive 98, the Aero 98 doesn't suffer from as much of that identity crisis. It just feels like it meshes spin and control in a more harmonious way than the Pure Drive does power and control. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, let's talk about the origin, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's not a racket that I recommend to anyone who wants to play competitive tennis. This racket is way too difficult to use for anyone who isn't named Rafael Nadal. First of all, it has a 375 swing weight, but even everything else about this racket screams difficult. The balance is almost even, so it feels very bizarre swinging through the air. You still get a bit of that Aero whippiness because of the design, but otherwise it just feels like a hammer that no one's going to be able to control. If you do manage to swing it, I won't deny it, it feels absolutely phenomenal. There is a very raw, ultra-stable, very powerful sensation as the ball pops off the string bed. The problem is you get about 3 of those before you're too tired and need to put it down. Basically, this is a collector's item that you can take out once in a while if you miss Nadal once he retires, but I really wouldn't recommend shoehorning it into your game. The more viable option here is the Rafa. It's significantly lighter and has a much more manageable 325 swing weight, but it has a similar balance so you can at least experience what Nadal does when he swings his origin. Seriously, it's just a Rafael Nadal racket for dummies. He's way better and stronger than all of us, so him swinging a 330 gram, 375 swing weight racket is what we're going to feel swinging a 290 gram, 325 swing weight racket. The balance being so far up the head is actually kind of fun because you can transfer so much of your swing's energy directly into the ball, but of course you're sacrificing control in doing so. Also, keep in mind this isn't just a current Aero 100 with a fancy paint job. It has the same layup as Rafa's origin, which is a layup from the mid-2000s, so it's much more raw, unforgiving, and a little bit less comfortable than the current Aero. The Pure Drive and Pure Aero are by far Babolat's most popular lines, and that power and spin style of racket is definitely what has made the brand what it is today. but Babolat also has a very solid control line in the Pure Strike. Now right off the bat, you look at the Pure Strike and it weighs 305 grams with a 98 square inch head size, and you think to yourself, well, that must be very similar to the Pure Drive and Pure Aero 98s, right? Well, no, and I know this is something that our more techie viewers will already know, but tweaks in beam design, whether they're subtle or more in your face, have huge impacts on playability, and that's the difference here. The unique beam designs in the Pure Drive and Pure Aero 98s are what make those rackets good for power and spin, but they also change that classic feel, which is a key component in making a racket good for control. That's where the Strike is a clear step ahead. Because the beam has a lower profile, you have much more feel for the ball, and it's also less launchy and more inherently controlled than the other two 98s. I do still want to make one thing clear about the Strike 98 though. As good as this racket's control is, it's still certainly not as traditional as other control rackets on the market right now. It has a non-constant beam, which helps with power and stability, but it does take away from that ultra-consistent, flexible feel of something, again, like a Prestige. It also has quite a bit of technology going on inside the layup, which isn't a bad thing because it helps solidify the racket, but it also means you don't have the most pure, unadulterated ball feel, which takes away a bit of control. Also, the 1619 and 1820 have really high swing weights, and when you couple that with the slightly more resistant beam, these are pretty powerful control rackets. On the 1619, you definitely need to use spin to control the launch, so if you want a more laser-like flat control racket, go for the 1820. It feels a little bit more stable, and the tighter string bed brings the launch angle a little lower, which means you won't have to add as much spin to the ball to control its depth. I am a huge fan of the Pure Strike 98s though. I think it is the best take on this modern idea of a control racket that doesn't try to be super traditional, and that's the key takeaway here. Much more control than Babolat's other 98s, but also less control than super traditional control rackets. That's where the Pure Strike 97 comes in. This is Babolat's most control-oriented racket. It has the smallest head size, the thinnest beam, and a 16x20 string pattern. The sweet spot is really small, so it also feels the best when you hit it right, and there's also the least amount of tech pumped into this racket, which takes away from that classic ball feel. Think of the Strike 97 like this. If the Pure Drive 98 and Pure Aero 98 are more control-oriented versions of Babolat's power and spin lines, then the Strike 97 is a more control-oriented version of Babolat's control line. Everything about this racket is designed to be as traditionally controlled as possible, except for one tiny thing, and this does still bug me, the non-constant beam. I really don't understand it because a 21mm constant beam would have been so buttery soft and flexible that this could have been the ultimate control racket, but that's not the case, and you definitely feel a little bit of pushback on contact. It's nothing crazy, but I definitely notice it, and when everything else about the frame is super traditional, I want the cleanest possible feel. One other thing to note with the Strike 97 is that it absolutely needs customization if you want to get the most out of it. The static weight is a little low, and the swing weight is really low, so it needs that extra boost in stability if you don't want it to get pushed around. To me, this is one of those rackets that once you dial it in, you're going to be absolutely in love with it, but it definitely takes some time, and me personally, I've never been able to fully mesh with it. I do like the 98s a little bit more, even though they do have that slightly less traditional feel, but again, the 97 is the one to go for if you want that ultra low powered controlled response in Babolat's line. That's all the rackets. I guess it did end up taking as much time as talking about Head's lineup, but we got there in the end. With that said, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of these rackets, you can come visit us in store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.